This is a verse that talks about there being something in you, something good in you, that you probably don't even know is there. And in fact, until or unless life circumstances get to the point where they demand that you reach down and find something in you that you never dreamed was there, you could easily live and die, never knowing what potential was really within you. That is the idea in what the Lord said to Gideon. In Judges chapter 6, verse 14, the Lord had come to Gideon in the form of an angel. He'd given him a humongous task. That is, I want you to deliver your people from their enemies. I want you to lead in a victory over a force that is mightier. They are manier because there's way more of them. Your bunch doesn't stand a chance, but I want you to do something, Gideon. I want you to go in the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. Zero in on those words in the middle. Go with the strength you have. Now, if you're like a whole lot of people, if you're like I've been a whole lot of times, if somebody tells me to go in the strength that I have, the first thing I'm going to ask is, what strength? What strength are you talking about? Many of us are well acquainted with our weaknesses. You may not advertise them. You may not even be willing to admit them to anybody else. But I bet you know what they are. You know what your weaknesses are, but do you know what your strengths are? Fairly often, somebody will talk to me and say, Lance, I hear in church my whole life, I hear about spiritual gifts, and everybody has a special gift, and therefore there's something there to do. But I don't have a gift. Listen, everybody's got something. If nothing else, you got something that a certain middle-aged man in India has. He has a gift that he cultivated. It may not have been much, but he took the gift he had. He had to first see it as a gift, and he grew that gift to the point that he got in the Guinness Book of World Records. Now let me tell you about him. His name is Randakant Bapai. He's 50 years old. And this man from India recently entered the World Guinness Book of Records for the longest ear hair on the planet. Now, some of you women thought your husband was in the running for that. But something about we hit 40, those start growing. A lot of people wouldn't see it as a strength, but he did. He started combing them every day, grooming them, conditioner, and at the longest, 5.2 inches of ear hair. You know, I'm starting to get thin up top. I'm thinking about growing my eyebrows out and combing them back. Or I could grow out my ear hair and swoop them over. You know what I'm really saying to you? That's silly, I know. But there's a man who can look at himself and see that he's got something going for him that the average person doesn't. And I hear somebody laughing because you don't think that was going for him. But he made national news. He's in the Guinness Book of Records. He got paid for it. And listen to his response. He said, "This is indeed a special occasion for me and my family." And he added, "God has been very kind to me." Now, what is your gift? I bet you that whatever it is, it's something better than ear hair. And so when I tell you, thus saith the Lord, go in the strength you have, don't tell me you don't have any strengths. All you have is undiscovered potential. And that is exactly what Gideon had. Go in the strength you had. At that point, Gideon had not displayed any kind of strength. He had not displayed any sort of leadership ability, much less military might. But there was something in him that had never come out. Why? I've already told you why. It's because life had never demanded it. Most of us don't know what we're capable of doing until life gets so hard, circumstances get so big and bad that we call forth everything we got and discover we got more than we realized. Specifically, Gideon turned out to be a master of military psychology. Because with 300 men, he surrounded a camp of Midianites who covered an entire valley like locust. And as I told you last week, at night, their campfires were so many that they lit up the sky all around like midday. And with 300 men, he used a powerful psychological tool. Long before anybody knew about psychology, Gideon gave each man a torch, a pitcher, and a trumpet. Now, how's that for military equipment? A torch, a clay pot, and a trumpet? But he understood that even the mightiest of men, when caught off guard, when surprised, will react in frightful ways. They will forget their training. Now, if he had approached them in any kind of conventional way, I can almost assure you that it would have been something their commanders had covered in training. But I can also promise you, in boot camp, they did not learn what to do if suddenly you hear hundreds of pitchers break and the lights are all around you and trumpets are blasting. There were no drills on that. Gideon had this gift. He used it because life demanded it. And I ask you, what is life demanding of you right now? What is it that's coming against you right now? It may be some oppressive person, some oppressive force. Perhaps it is simply a troubling decision, a difficult choice you've got to make, and you are at a loss as to what to do. And on certain days, or at least at certain hours during the day, you think you know what you're going to do, and then you see it from a different angle, and all of a sudden you get scared. No, that's not going to work after all. And you're back to wondering, what are you going to do? I'm telling you that the best things in us don't come out until God and circumstances cooperate. They join forces and bring out things in us. But Gideon was a humble man. In the beginning, he did what most everybody in the Bible and most everybody I've ever known does when they realize they're being called upon to do something they've never done before. What we do when we realize we're being called upon to do something we don't think we can do, we start making our excuses. We start pointing out our weaknesses. We downplay our strength. And sometimes, by the way, that is really nothing more than a false humility. Are you one of those people who absolutely cannot take a compliment? Do you know what kind of people I'm talking about? It seems like half of us are that way. There are plenty of people who do truly good things. They are contributing to their church, in their workplace, in their family, in the school. They're contributing in ways that really do count. And they need to know it. But you know what happens when somebody points out their strong point? Oh, no, that's nothing. I hope I can at least do that. I'm sure not any good at anything else. And somehow by doing that, they think they're why am I going blank? Because I don't get it. I don't know what we're thinking when we do that. I know I used to do it. And I felt it was my job, my humble duty to play down anything good. Well, is that the way you want your children to talk? Your grandchildren, your children whom you love, you've poured your best into them. You believe in them. You want the best for them. You want the best from them. And if you decide to affirm your child, say something encouraging. I don't mean something you don't mean. Never do that, by the way. That's called flattery. I'm talking about genuine affirmation that everybody needs a little of and some people need a lot of. If you say something encouraging to your child and they just poo-poo on it and act like they're a nothing, does that somehow make you pleased? What kind of a God and Father do you think we've got? Do we have this God who loves to hear us talk about what low-down worms we are? Or do we have a God who made men and women in His image and said it is very good? Who inspired the writer who said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Be willing. Be willing to receive honest, positive feedback. Go in the strength you have. Well, what was this going to require of Gideon? I asked that for a very specific reason. What was all of this going to require of Gideon? Because up until now, all I've done is talk about words. I've talked about attitudes. I've talked about believing in God and believing in ourselves. I've talked about accepting affirmation. I've even hinted at the importance of affirming others. But you know what? All of that is still in the category of thought. Thought and words. Thought and words. Words and thought. Words and thought are important as long as we use our thoughts to create words that then motivate us to do something. But if we don't do something with the words of God, if we don't do something in response to the thoughts God gives us, then we deceive ourselves. I mean, one of the first verses I ever learned in Sunday school was from the book of James. Be not merely hearers of the word, deceiving yourselves, but be doers of the word. And I, as a second grader, applied that to, okay, I don't steal pencils. I don't need to look on my neighbor's paper during a test. Yeah, that fits. I was being a doer of the word by being honest. But, oh my goodness, it goes so much further, so much deeper and wider than that. To be a doer of the word means you go out and do stuff. I talked about this last week when I played the character of Gideon, but I got to drive it home today. As long as you talk about what you're going to do, let me say this, a certain amount of talking is necessary. There's a season for everything, remember? Certain amount of time you need to spend thinking, talking, listening. But a lot of people are deceived. They deceive themselves thinking, okay, because I now believe correctly and I now see this correctly, I'm good. Actually, nothing has changed. Things change when you take what's on the inside and you do something. God's first directions to Gideon were to win a battle in his family of origin. You know from last week's story, and you know from your knowledge of the Bible and Gideon, that the big thing he did, the thing he's famous for, was leading his people to defeat their oppressors, the Midianites. Yes, of course, that was a big, open, public victory. But it was preceded by a private, very personal, and very small scale victory. Here is the place where God started him. God knows where we are. He knows that there are some journeys that cannot be made in a single bound. There are some steps that are going to involve several steps. If you're going to change from doing the kind of self-destructive or just plain old ineffective stuff you're doing now to doing things that change your life and change your family and the people around you, usually you won't make that in a single step. It'll be a series of steps. For Gideon, there was at least one step in between his initial challenge and his big final major victory. It was, you have to stand up to your father and your brothers. Gideon, just so happens, was the youngest of the brothers in his family. And his family, by the way, were Baal worshipers. His father was a Baal worshiper. His brothers were Baal worshipers. In fact, his father and brothers had constructed the altar to Baal and the statue of Baal that sat right in the middle of their village. And you know what God commanded him to do? Go tear it down. You, Gideon, you go tear it down. Look at chapter 6, verse 25 and 26. That night the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar. Listen to this part. Using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down. Not only was he going to tear down the Baal altar, he was going to use the broken materials, the rock to rebuild an altar to God and to make the sacrifice, he was going to use the wood of the Asherah pole. That's a complete victory. But here is why that mattered. If you read about Gideon carefully in the verses leading up here, as I did in preparation, it becomes obvious that Gideon definitely saw himself as the least important person in his family. The least influential, least likely to succeed, unaware of any special strength he may have. And what he was being asked to do is do something that he pretty well knows will displease his father. Gideon was a grown man by now. I'm a grown man. But do you know what? I still want my daddy to be proud of me. And some of the saddest moments in my life have been those moments when I suspected he was not proud. When I sensed that I had somehow disappointed or let him down. Gideon is being asked to do something which he assumes is going to disappoint his father. He's afraid his father is going to interpret this as an act of rebellion. You're spitting in my face? Who do you think you are? And not to mention the older brothers. He could very well be kicked out of the family. But do you know what happened? Gideon was in for a surprise. He went by night. That's worth commenting on right there. God told him to go, so he went, but not in broad daylight. He went under cover of darkness, and he did all of this, and it was the next morning before anybody figured out what had happened. They noticed the old altar's gone, and here's the new one. He went under cover of darkness, which means he did not have complete faith in himself or complete faith in God. He still had fear. By the way, the bravest of people still have some kind of fear. It's just that they don't allow the fear to stop them. But I want to point out one variable here that could have messed some of us up in our minds. Not all of you will relate to this, but some of you will, especially if you're a perfectionist. Consider this. Consider this. Gideon was doing what God told him to do, but he was doing it under cover of darkness. He was going to slip around and do it and just hope nobody found out that it was him. That's very different than just boldly marching into town in the middle of the day and as with your axe in one hand and your sword on your hip and go to town demolishing that altar, sort of like Jesus did in the temple. No fear there. Gideon didn't have that kind of faith that Jesus had. And you know what some of us would have said? Some of us would have said, I'd have said, well, you know what? Because I don't have enough guts to do it all out, because I'm not brave enough to do it in broad daylight, maybe it's not worth doing it all. And what that's called is all or nothing thinking. And it will destroy your peace of mind, and it will prevent you from doing lots and lots of good things. Because anytime you get ready to do anything for another person, in the service of God, for any good reason at all, there's going to be something in your motives that's not quite what it should be. There's going to be something about your performance which is not quite perfect. and you'll be able to look back on what you just did and see the mistakes you made. And yet in reality, you still got it done. But a lot of people rob themselves of victory. They rob themselves of confidence, faith, and peace, because if they can't do it perfectly, they won't do it at all. And if they're not able to do it in the way that they imagine it should be done, they will allow that to so discourage them that they either won't do it at all, or they'll do it but with half-hearted determination. Listen, a victory is a victory. If Alabama shuts out Arkansas in a regular season game, that's a victory. I just said the wrong thing. And I didn't plan that. Does that mean the sermon's ruined? For some people, maybe. But for most of you, you can recognize, okay, Lance shouldn't have said that. He should have left that alone. But the sermon as a whole can still help me. I hope you can do that. This is a good opportunity to do what I'm talking about. You recognize that because you make one or two mistakes doesn't mean you've lost. Whether you win by 1 point in overtime or whether you completely shut them out and they never scored at all, a win is a win. Give yourself credit for some of your wins. Your children who aren't perfect, most of them aren't in prison either. Your spouse, your marriage that's not everything you wish it was, I can guarantee you there are parts of it that other people look at and think, I wish I had that. I've been able to meet, talk, counsel with a lot of people through the years. A lot of them in relation to marriage or just some other part of something else from their life. Their job was bothering them, for an example. And I've come to realize that I've not talked to anybody yet whose life or whose wife was so bad that nobody else would have wanted it. But if you are an all or nothing thinker, then one mistake and the whole thing's a flop. That's the kind of thing that'll drive you to drinking. It truly will. Thank God for grace. The grace of God is not about all or nothing thinking. The grace of God is about the reality that all of us have sinned and fallen short to one degree or another. 200 of us in 200 entirely different ways. But His grace is sufficient. Because God's not a perfectionist. If He were, there'd be no forgiveness. By the way, can you forgive yourself? Listen, if the God who knows you better than yourself and knows exactly every minute little detail that went into the doing of everything you ever did or thought or said, if He can forgive you, one who's perfect, ease up on yourself. Well, Gideon win. He didn't do it. It wasn't a pretty win. It wasn't a perfect win, but he did it. And so it was a win. Next morning, everybody woke up. They were troubled. Now, I want to take you back to the scripture. They began to question, who did this? Who did this? And they put two and two together and all the other pieces, and they came to the obvious conclusion that it was Gideon. And so they came to the door of Joash, father of Gideon. Now remember, this is the man Gideon wanted so much to please. He just didn't think he could. He had apparently never heard his father say, "I'm proud of you." He'd apparently never heard his father say, "Good job. I'm glad you're my boy." So he was scared to death. They beat on the door of the house. He probably figured that his father was not only going to send him out to the folks, to the mob that assemble, basically a lynch mob. Father will probably even give him the rope to hang me with. But no, when they said, "Bring out your son," Gideon's father said something that must have changed Gideon's life. Gideon's father shouted to that mob that confronted him. He said, "Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself and destroy the one." And from then on, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal defend himself, because Gideon broke down Baal's altar. Do you know what happened that day? The father he thought was going to disown him and reject him was proud of him. Was it what his father would have recommended? No. But for the first time in his son's life, his son actually did something that called for some guts. He did something knowing that somebody was going to be disappointed. Do you know that in order for you to do anything in this world, accomplish anything in this world, you will inevitably disappoint, insult, or make somebody mad in the process? There is no such thing as a successful servant of God or a successful person, period, who pleases everybody. And as long as you're trying to please them all, you'll probably wind up pleasing none. And worst of all, you won't even be pleased with yourself. Here's what it comes down to, and here's what I close with. Gideon was placed in a situation that called forth something he didn't know was there, remember? A strength. In this case, it turned out to be a strength to take a bold stand he didn't think he could make. What did it come down to? He found himself in a position that everybody here can relate to. He found himself in a position where he was going to disappoint somebody no matter what. He feared he was either going to disappoint his family or he was going to disappoint God. Either his family was going to be displeased with him or God was going to be displeased with him. And it really came down to this. Of the two options, which one is he more afraid of disappointing? And he was more afraid of disappointing God. But when I say he was afraid of disappointing God, am I saying that he was afraid that if I don't do this, God's going to strike me with a lightning bolt? He's going to open up the earth and swallow me up? No, God had made no threats. God didn't say anything like, do this or else I'm going to kill you. God's invitations to join him in his work are always open-ended. So why was Gideon afraid of disappointing God, of letting God down? Here's why. Because when you make a weak choice that lets God down, all you've really done is let yourself down. Because you just said no to a step, an action step, that could have not only fulfilled God's will through you, but it could have brought a victory and a sense of momentum and meaning to your life that you'll never taste until you actually do something